Okay, welcome to the Big Book Comes Alive Step Study Workshop, week number 31 in the current cycle. I believe this is the fifth Zoom cycle, but it's definitely the 31st week in this cycle. And we have done an awful lot of work, and where we find ourselves is on the doorstep of chapter 5 of how it works. Or as I thought it should be said, how it works. Be that as it may. I love doing this chapter, especially the first week, because we're going to do things a little, I don't know, differently than you may have had them experience elsewhere. We're going to go through these first 3 pages several times. We're going to go through it obviously the way it appears in the book, and go through it our usual way of breaking it down and defining and highlighting and underlining, but we're going to do that last. Before that, we're going to go through it and contrast the way it was originally written by Bill Wilson and appeared in the first manuscripts, and contrast that with the way it appears today. We're going to make note of the changes, and we're going to talk about why we think some of those changes were made. But more importantly, I think we're going to start with background. We're going to start with history. I could, at this point in the writing process, I can practically see Bill Wilson sitting there thinking, I've thoroughly reviewed the problem in the doctor's opinion and in my story. And part of there is a solution. I've told them what's going to happen if they don't find that solution in chapter 3, more about alcoholism. And I've given them some new ideas so they might be able to make a decision regarding this power greater than themselves in chapter 4, we agnostics. So I've done all the preliminary work, and it's probably time to lay out this program of action that we've been referring to for 50 some odd pages. Remember, the main purpose of this book, we're told back on page 48, the main purpose is to enable you to find a power which will solve your problem. And that's done through this program of action that we're going to get to. So Bill sits down and he writes what is perhaps the most significant pattern for living, arguably since the 10 Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount. According to Dr. Bob, he said, I think this is one of the great instances of divine inspiration in human history. And I agree with that there's nothing in Bill Wilson's past and his history to indicate he has the capability of writing anything in this book, let alone what we just read in There's a Solution and We Agnostics, and especially what's coming up here. So, Andy, if you can give me slide number 1, we're going to get started. If you have the handouts that I sent in the email, we're going to be going through the one called Thoughts on the First 3 Pages of How It Works. So, nope, we're going to start with slide number 1, not 5-1, which is, I'm sorry, it's 5-4 is the name of the handout. There we go.
What they say?
It was, and as we go through these,
okay. All right.
Sorry, let's mute everyone again. As we go through these excerpts, I want you to take note of the dates. So I've put them in highlights. I've made a larger font and I've put it in red because it's important to make note of when these things took place so we can get an idea of the chronology of how these things happened, of things like the 6 steps. When did they start talking about that? Was it before this book or was it after this book? All of those things we're going to get into. And Bill says it was now realized that we had enough background and window dressing material, and at this point, we'd have to tell how our program for recovery from alcoholism really worked. The backbone of the book would have to be fitted in right here. Bill wrote that in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age in 1957. So that was the assignment. That was the assignment that he was given when he sat down to do this. But what was the environment? What was the environment? What was the culture like in this as yet unnamed fledgling society? What exactly was the program they were following at that time? The book was being written in 1938, and they've been following a program for the last 4 or 5 years. What was that? Andy, let's go to slide 2. Since Ebby's visit to me in the fall of 1934, we gradually evolved what we called the word of mouth program. Most of the basic ideas had come from the Oxford groups, William James and Dr. Silkworth, though subject to considerable variation. Please note those terms. Subject to considerable variation, it all boiled down into a pretty consistent procedure which comprised 6 steps. They were approximately, notice the terms, subject to variation, approximately. 1, we admitted we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we made a moral inventory of our defects or sins. 3, we confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. 4, we made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. 5, we tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. And 6, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. This was the substance, again, substance, approximate, variation, the substance of what by the fall of 1938, we were telling newcomers. And Bill wrote that in 1957. 1957. Slide 3, Andy, if you would. In the big book, there's a story. He sold himself short, which first appeared in the 2nd edition. We read it now in the 4th edition and assume it was in the book all along. It was not. It was added in the 2nd edition, which was 1955. Earl Treat wrote that. That was his story, and he helped form the first AA group in Chicago. But he said, this 6-step program as it was at the time, he says he worked this 6-step program as it was at the time with Dr. Bob, and he laid it out. This is on in the big book, and like I said, in the 2nd edition, you'll probably find it. Complete deflation. 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power. 3, moral inventory. 4, confession. 5, restitution. 6, continued work with other alcoholics. Now, this was written in 1955. He was talking about his working the steps with Dr. Bob, and this is how he described it. So we already now have at least 2 versions. The one that I just read a moment ago and this one, they're not exactly the same. The gist of them are similar, but words like variation and approximately tell you that it was changing depending on who was doing it. Andy, let's go to the next slide. In July 1953, in the Grapevine article titled A Fragment of History, Origin of the 12 Steps, which was reproduced in Language of the Heart, published in 1953, this is what Bill wrote. During the next 3 years after Bob's recovery, our growing groups at Akron, New York, and Cleveland evolved the so-called word-of-mouth program of our pioneering time as we commenced to form a society separate from the Oxford group. We began to state our principles something like this: variation, approximately, something like this. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we got honest with ourselves. 3, we got honest with another person in confidence. 4, we made amends for harms done. And 5, we worked with other alcoholics without demand for prestige or money. And 6, we prayed to God to help us do these things as best we could. Listen to this. These principles were advocated according to the whim or liking of each of us. This was the gist of our message to incoming alcoholics up to 1939. That means that I worked the steps with Andy, and Andy interpreted what I said with Anita, and Anita worked them with Kathy, and Kathy worked them with C, and C worked it with Paul, and on and on and on. But it was a game of telephone. You know what happens in telephone. If I whisper something in Andy's ear, by the time it gets to Paul, it's changed already, and that's only 5 or 6 people down. That's the way the program was communicated at that time. So in using terms like I just described, word of mouth, gist, subject to variation, approximately, something like, Andy, you could take that down for a minute. We'll come back to it. According to the whim and liking of each of us, it was clear that the need for consistency was critical before the program became so distorted and so diluted to the point where it was going to be completely unrecognizable. So Bill's assignment then was to state the program in writing, no more word of mouth interpretation. So let's look at how he wrote the first 3 pages of this chapter, which includes the 12 steps, and what the expectations of the fellowship were, and what the reactions of the fellowship were. Andy, let's go to slide number 5, if you would. Bill wrote the 12 steps while lying in his bed at 182 Clinton Street with pencil in hand and a pad of yellow scratch paper on his knee. That's how he liked to write. He had a pad, he had a pencil, he wrote his notes, and then he came into the office in the morning and dictated them as he walked around the office. He liked to dictate to Ruth. But this was written in Pass It On in 1984. Let's go to slide number 6. In Language of the Heart, fragment of history. I read something from it before, now we're coming back to it. 1953. That's when this was written. So he's looking back. In 1953, he wrote the following. I well remember the evening on which the 12 steps were written. I was lying in bed, quite dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. That's one thing we don't get into too much here. Bill's being a hypochondriac, but he was. 4 chapters of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, had been roughed out and read in meetings at Akron in New York. We quickly found that everybody wanted to be an author. And incidentally, those 4 chapters didn't include how it works or into action. We quickly found that everybody wanted to be an author. The hassles as to what should go into our new book were terrific. For example, some wanted a purely psychological book. A few, led by our wonderful Southern friend Fitz Mayo, wanted a fairly religious book infused with some of the dogma, some of the religious dogma we picked up from the churches and missions which had tried to help us. The louder these arguments became, the more I felt in the middle. It appeared I wasn't going to be the author at all. I was only going to be an umpire who would decide the contents of the book. Having arrived at chapter 5, it seemed high time to state what our program really was. I remember running over in my mind the word of mouth phrases then in current use. We just went through several of those variations in the word of mouth program, and he's thinking about all of those. So he said, jotting these down, they added up to the 6 named above. Then came the idea that our program ought to be more accurately and clearly stated. Distant readers have have a precise set of principles. Knowing the alcoholic's ability to rationalize, something airtight would have to be written. We couldn't let the reader wiggle out anywhere. He knew who he was dealing with. We are going to find wiggle room and excuses and reasons why we're going to do things differently if you let us interpret things. So he says, besides, a more complete statement would help in the chapters to come, where we would need to show exactly how the recovery program ought to be worked. Next page, Andy. In slide number 6, in meetings at Akron. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Alcoholics Now. You're right, Andy. I'm just skipping. I'm sorry. In Alcoholics Comes of Age in 1957, Bill wrote, in that particular evening, as my mind ran over these developments, it seemed to me that the program was still not definite enough. Our literature would have to be as clear and comprehensive as possible. Our steps would have to be more explicit. There must not be a single loophole through which the rationalizing alcoholic could wiggle out. Finally, I started to write. I set out to draft more than 6 steps. How many more, I didn't know. I relaxed and asked for guidance. So he prayed. With a speed that was astonishing, I completed the first draft. How's this? It took perhaps half an hour. The first 3 pages of how it works, some of the most important spiritual information ever written, took him a half hour to write. Is it odd or is it God? So he said the words kept right on coming. At this moment, a couple of late callers arrived. I love this. One of them was Howard. The first guy he read the steps to was a guy named Howard. How cool is that? Well, I think it's cool, at least. I'm sure if it was your name, you'd think it was cool. In any case, Howard came by, not Howard E., Howard A., with a newcomer. I was greatly pleased with what I'd written, and I read them, the new version of the program, now the 12 steps. Howard and his friend reacted violently. Violently. Why 12 steps? You've got too much God in these steps. You'll scare people away. And what do you mean by getting these drunks down on their knees when they ask to have all their shortcomings removed? And you'll see that was in the original steps. And who wants all their shortcomings removed anyway? You've got to tone it down, Bill. It's too stiff. The average alcoholic just won't buy it the way it stands. So Bill says, I sprang to the defense of the new creation, every single word of it. He protected it like his children. A terrific discussion developed, which cooled only when Lois turned up a couple of hours later. So Bill and Howard and this newcomer are going around and around for several hours. Lois said, why don't you forget about it for a while? Have a cup of coffee. This we did. However, upon awakening the next day, Bill was just as committed as he was to his new creation the night before. And he set out to give it to the rest of the fellowship. And that's when the shit hit the fan. What the hell, Andy, you could take that down for a minute. What the hell is this, they said. God gave man the 10 commandments. Now you've got 12. 6 had been quite sufficient for us up until now. This sounds way too much like the Oxford group. You're giving people directions and you don't have the right to tell them what to do. Some wanted more Christian doctrine. Some wanted more use of the word God. Others wanted the word God deleted from the book entirely. Hello, New York. That's what they wanted. One group wanted a more psychological book rather than a spiritual approach. And Bill this and Bill that and Bill and Bill and Bill and on the quarreling almost destroyed the entire fellowship as well as the book project. Now, what I'm going to give you now is some information. Well, no, let's do this first. Let's go to slide 8. As the one who had to do the writing, this is what Bill said, continuing in Comes of Age in 1957. As the one who had to do the writing, I was squarely in the middle of this arguing. For a while, it looked as if we would bog down into permanent disagreement. Despairing of satisfying everyone, I finally asked that I might be the final judge of what the book said. Seeing that we would get nowhere without such a point, they agreed. Now, they agreed begrudgingly because what Bill said is, you write the book yourself or leave me alone to write it. I will take suggestions, but it's up to me. I will be the final arbiter of what goes in the book. And they said, yeah, they agreed to do that. So Bill agreed to some of the modifications. Andy, you could take that down for a minute. He agreed to some of the modifications that they asked to be done, some of the changes, and you're going to see what they are as we go through them. And it's a great testament, I think, to Bill's ability as a teacher and a salesman, because most of what he originally wrote that night remained intact, remained exactly the way he wrote it, with all of that so-called discord. So from that moment on, Bill was supposed to be the final arbiter of what went on and into that book. However, and here's where it gets interesting. What I'm about to go through and talk to you about is stuff that came to light a few years ago. Andy, if I can get slide number 9. Came to light when my friend Bill Shaberg from Fairfield, Connecticut, wrote a book called Writing the Big Book. He spent 9 years researching it, spent another 2 years writing and editing it. When the book came out, there were 300 some odd pages in the back of the book of footnotes, because everything he said, every point he made, he backed up. He didn't put anything in that book that he couldn't verify and prove. And I'm emphasizing that because what we're about to go through may surprise a lot of people. This book has become pretty popular by now, and a lot of you have read it. But when this book first came out a few years back, that wasn't the case. And this was incredibly illuminating information. So that's what Bill wants us to believe. Andy, you could take that down. The stuff I just read, this contentious atmosphere that there was this fight over every word and everything was this, Bill do this and Bill don't do that. And everyone was bitching and moaning. They wrote out each page and he sent it out to the fellowship and they sent it back with all of these changes. That's what Bill wants us to believe. And it makes for a great story. It really does. But as you're going to see, the truth was far more complicated than that simplified, dramatic explanation. Let's break it down into some of the myths. First, let's talk about this contentious atmosphere, about the quote, many voices atmosphere of the fellowship at the time. Andy, let's have slide number 10. In writing the big book, and we're going to start to quote most of the stuff from that book, in Akron's response, right up to the middle of Akron's response, right up to the middle of November of 1938. Remember, the book was published 5 months later in April 39, was simply to say, quote, they liked the chapters already sent to them. Given this disappointing lack of response, Bill complained to Dr. Bob that he wished that he would be more critical. I think it can be improved a lot. And elsewhere noted that despite the fact that each of the chapters was sent to Ohio, quote, for debate and inspection, Bob never passed them around much, merely writing me saying he thought they were all right. You see, Dr. Bob didn't pass it around in Akron because nobody in Akron wanted the book. They were vehemently, violently against Bill Wilson in this book. They were not about to approve or comment on the chapters because if you handed them the chapter, they'd throw it in the trash. That was the atmosphere in Akron. So Dr. Bob protected Bill by not sending it around. He just said, they're all right. Things in New York were a bit different, but not different enough to generate any kind of serious criticism for what Bill had written so far. I find it pretty hard, he told Bob in November, to get people to voice their real opinions, as they are too much afraid of hurting my feelings. Whatever reasons there might be for the New York reticence, the result was Bill Wilson was writing in a virtual vacuum with little substantive feedback. Next page, Andy, number 11. As Ruth Hock, Bill's secretary, later noted, the major changes made to the steps and the rest of the book were fought out in the office, Honors Dealers in Newark, New Jersey, when Bill and Hank and Fitz and I were present. And Jim Burwell consistently claimed it was the trio of Bill Wilson, Hank Parkhurst, and Fitz Mayo who ran AA during those early days. And Ruth's testimony about those arguments in Newark certainly lends credibility to that observation. Next page. It's perfectly reasonable to wonder then where this popular and persistent creation story of a contentious, elaborate collaborative writing process for the text of the big book came from. Where did it come from? Where did these stories come from? Well, one reason for this duplicity was the need to bolster the illusion that the book was the report of the collective experience of, quote, 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state, rather than just being a condensed version of Wilson's personal experiences and his observations during the first 4 years of his sobriety, which for the most part is what it was. The power of the communal experience, rather than that of one individual, was increasingly recognized as one of the most important parts of the message promoted by AAA. And it was therefore vitally important that the story of the book's origins be presented as a participatory group effort rather than the work of just one man. Next page. In addition to this larger purpose, Bill had an important personal reason for making light of his sole authorship of the book. As this new method of recovery spread across the country, Wilson grew increasingly uncomfortable with the mantle of sanctity that was constantly being foisted upon him by these new groups and members. Knowing how much this kind of hero worship played directly into his desire to be, quote, the number one man, Bill realized he needed to put a number of serious checks on his own ego. And one of the ways he did this was to regularly downplay his central importance in the writing of the book. Next page, Andy. So then here are the first few pages so how were those first few pages actually written? Well, There are unfortunately no primary documents mentioning the actual writing of the steps. Not that piece of paper he wrote it on, not the notes about it, nothing. So now, at arguably the single most significant moment in the entire story, any historical account must rely solely, entirely on the stories Bill Wilson told about how he wrote the steps. There is not one document, not a single document preserved from December 1938 or the months immediately after that to confirm or contradict his version of what happens. It's simply not mentioned. Compounding the problem and raising serious suspicion about Bill's absolute accuracy here is the fact that the first recorded instance of him telling the well-known story appears in a letter he wrote to Jack Alexander on December 13th, 1949, a full 11 years after the event. Again, the dates are so important. He wrote the book in 1939, and for 10 years he told the story. The first time he put it on paper was when he told it to Jack Alexander in 1949. How so much time could have elapsed without this important story being told sooner is a mystery. Andy, next page. This is truly problematic, as Bill Wilson was no great respecter of the actual facts when it came to AA history. When he wrote or talked, his purpose was not to deliver a precisely accurate account of what happened. Whenever inconvenient or messy details were encountered, Bill would modify them, sometimes significantly, and then streamline the whole story for the dramatic impact he felt was necessary to underline the specific moral or inspirational message he was trying to deliver to his audience. Historians who rely on Bill's talks or his writings for reliable historical information do so at their own peril. In relation to this particular event, the day he first formulated and wrote down the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, we have no supporting contemporary documents whatsoever to rely on for confirmation or contradiction. There is only Bill's version of the story. There's a very different story about how Bill wrote the 12 steps. One he told almost 2 full years before he rolled out the story of being inspired to break down the existing 6-step program. So 2 years after he wrote the steps, this is what happened. Paul Kirby Hennessy accompanied Bill and Lois on a train ride from New York to Washington, and according to him, the conversation on the train naturally veered towards the 12 steps. In a memo dated October 12th, 1948, again, 9 years after the book was written, well, actually, 9 years, Hennessy writes, Bill went on to explain how the pioneers in AA fought, thought, and prayed their way to recovery. In the okay, let me mute everyone again. I'm getting some interference here. In an effort to rehabilitate himself, the alcoholic was obliged. This is what Bill told this guy in 1948. 1, to admit he was powerless over alcohol. 2, make an inventory of his own character. 3, put trust in God. 4, work with other alcoholics. 4 steps? Huh? I thought there were 6. He's talking about 4 steps. As it stood, the program needed clarification. So Bill sat down and he began to figure out the various phases of his own recovery. Setting them down on paper, he found there were 12 separate, distinct steps. According to the earliest available version of the story, later confirmed by Bill, the 12 steps weren't the result of a sudden inspirational expansion of the fellowship's collective experience. Quote, the 6 steps, which had gradually evolved since Ebby's visit. He's making it sound like this was the fellowship's collective experience, but rather a reformulation of the most important elements Bill can identify in the different actions he had taken on his road to sobriety. The creation of the 12 steps based on Wilson's own experience is, in fact, a much more likely scenario than the later claim of an inspired elaboration of the 6 steps. In Ernie Kurtz's book, Not God, which was our best history besides Comes of Age, our best history until writing the big book came out. In Ernest Kurtz, Not God, he says the exact formulation of the 6 steps was contrived by Wilson only as he set out to record the history in AA Comes of Age, 1957. Now, let me just explain that again. Let's go back to that, Andy, for a second. What Ernie Kurtz is saying in Not God is that the first mention anywhere in AA history of 6-step program was written in 1957. Almost 20 years since the book was written. These dates have a lot of importance. This is important stuff. All right, Andy, let's go to the next page. Questioning Wilson's veracity on this particular story naturally begs another question. Why would he change his 1948 train story about the 4 steps into the 6 steps he later told? Why not just continue with the story Paul Hennessy related about the 4 steps? The most plausible explanation is this change was another one of Wilson's attempt to direct attention away from himself and to dim the spotlight constantly shown on him for his central role in the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson would frequently declare that his only role was the umpire of the discussion that had created the book, a claim he repeated whenever he was given the chance. We read about it twice already. This is so far from the truth to be almost laughable, but it's a perfect example of the purposeful reformulation of AA history, of creative storytelling that Bill regularly used to protect himself from his own ego. Myth-making proved to be his best defense against the, quote, "You're the man who saved my life" adulation that followed him everywhere throughout the rest of his life. Can you imagine what that must be like? People everywhere he went would crowd around him and tell him, "You saved my life. You're the man who saved my life. You're the greatest thing since sliced bread." Let's talk about the 6-step program myth. Here's the next myth. Andy, hang on, put that down for a sec. One element in Wilson's story, the details of the so-called 6-step program, which supposedly preceded the 12 steps, has gained considerable attention from AA members over the years. Most of that interest has been driven by the misconception that there actually was a place before Bill Wilson invented the 12 steps. There was a program in place, rather, before Wilson invented those 12 steps. This mistaken belief was directly and decisively addressed in a recent comment made by AA historian Glenn Chestnut. Andy, next screen. This was written by Glenn Chestnut, AA historian. There's no evidence that there was any formal set of 6 steps being listed and followed by people in AA prior to Bill Wilson's writing the 12 steps in December 1938. People who like things neat and tidy with lists to memorize tend to get carried away with this idea of 6 steps and start imagining every AA meeting with a single window shade mounted on the walls displaying a list of the 6 steps and everybody sitting around memorizing and analyzing those 6 steps. Andy, take that down for a minute. I want to point out something. If anybody has a copy of the first edition and a reproduction of it, the personal stories in the back of the book, not a single personal story in the back of the book of the first edition mentions a 6-step program. Not one, not a word. Not a word about the 6-step program is contained in any of the personal stories. Nowhere does anyone mention it. The first mention was in the second edition Earl Treat story in 1955, 16 years after the first edition. So Wilson is clearly to blame for this misunderstanding because he mentions the 6-step program in a concrete, definitive way over and over with such regularity in his talks and his writings. Several examples are provided at the beginning of this talk. I gave you several examples of Bill saying and explaining what the 6-step program was. But Earl Treat's story was the first time it appeared in the Big Book, and that was 1955. Andy, let's go back to slide 21. There is simply no mention of the 6-step word of mouth program in any of Wilson's writings or talks until May of 1949 when he talked to Alexander. 10.5 years after he supposedly used them as a foundation for his creation of the 12 steps. Next page, Andy. Despite Wilson's claims that these 6 steps, this is back to writing the Big Book. Despite Bill's claims in 1949 that these 6 steps harken back to the very beginning of his own sobriety, they did not. In Bill's story, he acknowledged that the program of recovery changed considerably since Eber visited him in 1934. It had certainly evolved to the point where there was some sort of consistent routine approach helping people stay sober, but there's no mention of anything in the early records even remotely resembling Bill's reputed 6-step program. In Wilson's defense, it could be claimed that the historian's maxim, quote, absence of evidence is not proof of absence. Let me repeat that. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence. That might apply here, but there actually is a tremendous amount of contemporary documentation showing exactly what people were doing to get sober before Bill wrote the 12 steps. And none of it suggests anything like a 6-step program. Andy? In Fitzmayo's initial draft of his story is our Southern friend. Let me mute one. I know this is kind of detailed, but this is history and this is important stuff. And I'm fascinated by it, and I hope you are too. In Fitzmayo's initial draft of his story, this is what he wrote, and we have copies of this. The man, Bill Wilson, asked if I'd be willing to try to be completely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, absolutely loving to get rid of the drink problem. In that first draft, Fitz describes a program of recovery but it's such an abbreviated form. It is the pure Oxford group that salvation from alcohol can be had by adopting their four absolutes. Now, here's where it changed. By the time Fitz's story appeared in the first edition, and Bill had written how it works in the 12 steps, Bill, not Fitz, Bill changed Fitz's story considerably. And this is what it said in the story. Not the man asked if I'd be willing to be honest, pure, unselfish, and loving. This is what it said. Bill changed it to, he asked me if I believed in a power greater than myself, if I'm willing to right all the wrongs I've done. Am I willing to be honest with myself about myself and tell someone about myself? Am I willing to think of other people and their needs instead of myself to get rid of the drink problem? Next page, Andy. The original version of this encounter, which is surely how that conversation was actually went, was rewritten to conform to the changes in the program. Fitz wrote it the way it happened, that Bill called on him and asked if he was willing to be absolutely pure, absolutely honest, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving. Those were the four principles of the Oxford group. That's what they were using in those early years, not 6 steps. There's no history, no written history of 6 steps. The original version of this was rewritten to conform to those changes. And rather than being pressed to accept the 4 absolutes, something Eber almost certainly recommended during his famous late November kitchen visit with Bill, rather than the 6 steps Wilson later claimed Eber outlined, Fitz was now reporting that he was asked if he was willing to believe in any kind of God, if he'd be willing to take an honest inventory, then share it with another human being, make amends for wrongs, become less self-centered, more loving, caring, all of which were now in line with the so-called 6 steps of this newly minted 12-step program. Wilson's version of this story is a parable, a mythic truth deeply embedded in the story of AA's origins. Bill told this story this way because it made the points he wanted to make. In such cases, the actual facts were distinctly secondary to properly packaging and selling the concepts. Wilson had no problem justifying the creation of this much simplified story because doing so served his higher purpose. And as Eber said, because Eber always maintained that the story Bill tells of the kitchen talk was different than the way it actually happened. Eber said it didn't make any difference because the idea is there. The principle of the thing is the same. In writing about the differences between Bill and Eber's versions of their kitchen table talk, Schaberg states, as far as Bill Wilson was concerned, it was the idea and the principle of the thing that were far more important than any jumbled collection of facts. Wilson's story had drama, it had impact, it delivered an unmistakable message of hope. Eber Thatcher's did not. So that's the story, the background of our fellowship, of our 12 steps. So what I want to do, and I think we're going to run out of time, is I want to start by looking at the original version of those 3 pages and the way it appears in the book. Now, if you got the handout, Andy, if you want to put up 5-1 for a minute, you got a handout that looks like this. And I'm not going to keep this up because I want to read from it. It looks like this. And I've highlighted the changes that were made. One side is what was published, one side was as originally written. Andy, you could take that down. If you have the study version of the big book, in the gray pages at the back of the book, you'll find the original version. And that's what I'm going to be reading from. So what I'm going to suggest that you do is this. I'm asking that you go to page 50 in the book, 58. And I'm going to read to you the way it was originally written, and you'll see as you follow it in the actual fourth edition what the changes were. So I'm going to suggest you start at page 58, and I'm going to read to you the original with the changes that were made. Ready? I don't know how far we'll get, but we're going to start. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our directions, not path. Originally, it said directions. Bill is given directions. You're going to see that through all of this. They wanted Bill to soften up his language, to make it seem more like suggestions, to make it seem more like a collective. Bill was giving directions, and he betrayed it in the very first line here. We have thoroughly followed our directions. Directions became path, a path we all follow. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They're not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a way of life. A way of life was changed to a manner of living. Very much the same thing, but a manner of living is a little softer than a way of life. And you know that he put a way of life in the book in countless places. But here, he gave in to changing a way of life to a manner of living, which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories describe in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. If you've decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to follow directions, not take certain steps. Follow directions was changed to take certain steps.
Suggestion.
You make it more of a suggestion, right? Bill was not making suggestions. He was giving directions. The word suggestion didn't appear. Direction did. That's the second time he used it. At some of these, you may balk was changed to we balked. Collective, we balked. At some of these, you may balk. You may think you can find an easier, softer way was changed to we thought we could find an easier, softer way. We thought we could find is the way it appears. The way he wrote it was you may think you can find. Pointing. Bill was pointing at us all through this. He wasn't saying the we collective. He was saying you. You may think you could find an easier, softer way. We doubt if you can. We doubt if you can was changed to, but we could not. There's a definite difference of attitude there. Saying we doubt if you can do it is different than we could not. Continuing with all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Remember that you are dealing with alcohol, not we deal with alcohol. You are dealing rather than we deal. Again, directive. You are dealing. You balk. That you are dealing with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for you. Not too much for us. Too much for you was changed to too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. You must find him now. That's different than may you find him now. He's pointed. You must find him now. That was changed to may you find him now. Half measures will avail you nothing.
That's a ripoff.
There you go. That was taken from Peabody anyway. But half measures will avail you nothing was changed to half measures availed us nothing. You stand at the turning point was changed to we stood at the turning point. Again, you became the collective we. You stand at the turning point. Throw yourself under his protection. That was changed to we asked his protection. Throw yourself under his protection became we asked his protection and care with complete abandon. Now we think you can take it. That sentence was eliminated entirely. I love that. Now we think you can take it. That's out. The whole sentence. Bill, that's got to go. Now we think you can take it. Don't be such a smart ass, Bill. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as your program of recovery, was changed to suggested as a program of recovery, not your program of recovery, a program of recovery. And that's where I'm going to stop. We'll go through the 12 steps beginning there next week. We're going to continue contrasting what was written with what appeared in the book. And then we're going to go through it our usual way. So I'm going to turn off the recording, and if we got some questions, we'll go through that.